Well, all the same, all the same. What this boils down to, though, is that there will always be people willing to make, in effect, to weave defenses of presidential and other exertions of power that are not authorized by the Constitution. If it's Truman, then it'll be the historians on the left. And then when it's Bush, it'll be scholars on the right, like John Yoo, who teaches at Berkeley, who will come up with all these rationales as to why the president is perfectly entitled to do everything that he's doing. This is not surprising. This is how it works. This is what it means to be a court historian. You do what the regime wants. Well, what we've seen, though, is that these powers of the president to go to war have now gotten to the point where in the 1990s, in 1999, Bill Clinton actually bombed the Serbs even in the face of a congressional refusal to support the bombing, which would seem to me that would be an impeachable offense instead of the other thing that they wound up talking about. We then have this problem. Now, I've talked about this guy John Yoo. He was like one of these guys whose title has got 12 words. He's like the assistant to the assistant deputy assistant attorney general sort of thing in the Bush administration in the first term. But he's a legal scholar who's written an awful lot about the powers of the president in war and the powers of the president in our constitutional structure. And Yoo is one of the scholars who it is very widely believed was responsible for basically saying that the president can wiretap people without consulting Congress, and in fact, going against Congress's directives, he's free to do that. So Yoo has such an expansive view of the powers of the president that he was asked in a debate, are you saying that the president could order the torture of people, even contrary to congressional directives on the subject, and there would be no way to stop him? And you said, yeah, I do believe that. And they said, so are you saying that if the president thought that the best way to torture somebody was to take that person aside, find his son, and crush his son's testicles, the president could do that? And you responded, I think it would depend on why the president felt he needed to do that. So that's supposed to reassure us that if he doesn't have a good reason for the testicle crushing, we're not going to let him get away with it. And by the way, a lot of this ties into this signing statements issue. Some of you have probably heard of this. This is basically a Bush administration innovation, although you see them here and there, but they never had any real significance. The signing statement is this sort of statement that is issued alongside the signing of a bill, but it's typically not issued at the time. So in other words, when a bill is signed, you've got whatever the bill is, you've got the troop of Girl Scouts there smiling as the president is signing the bill. You've got this or that government hack in the background grinning like a sap. But the signing statement is usually just put in some, in the Federal Register, like some registry of documents, and usually not even read. But the signing statement is the president's chance, and that's what has happened under this administration, where there have been more legislative provisions challenged through signing statements than in all other administrations put together, where the president can say, this particular part of this legislation, I'm not going to enforce that. Or this particular thing, I interpret it this way, even though you probably interpreted it that way. So, for instance, there's a defense appropriations bill that said, look, no money set aside in this bill is to be spent on any type of offensive operation in Colombia between the government and the rebels. That is, you could, if there's some defensive measure necessary, that's one thing, but it does not authorize any offensive measure. And the signing statement said that the administration interprets this clause as being advisory in nature. So, we'll listen, we'll consider this, but if we feel like doing what we want to do, we're just going to go ahead with that. That's more or less the situation. That's what we face. And even areas where you think, you may think, all right, maybe some of what I've said involves constitutional clauses that are somehow unclear. I don't think so. Maybe that you could argue that. But you would at least think the First Amendment freedom of speech thing was clear enough. Freedom of speech is clear enough in the Constitution. And yet, just to give one example, my favorite, of course, during World War I, you've got people being thrown in jail for writing articles and giving speeches. And you even had such hysteria against the Germans that there were voluntary organizations founded in the United States to help enforce sedition legislation, to root out people who were disloyal or making disloyal comments about the war. So you actually had a group called the terrible threateners. And it was your job to make your neighbors uncomfortable if they said anything about the war. There was another group called the sedition slammers. I mean, this is like way worse than freedom fries, right? That, it's nothing compared to this. But then my favorite, because it's just so Bolshevik, the boy spies of America. How does this happen? Now, in this speech I gave in D.C. a few weeks ago, I pointed out that poor Eugene Debs, I don't agree with him on much. But on the great moral question of the day, he was right. He was against the war, and he gave a speech being against the war, and it was partly a good speech. I mean, some of this, it's a lot of socialist boilerplate, but part of it was a pretty good speech. So he was imprisoned for years for this, and petitions kept coming in to Woodrow Wilson to free him, and every one of them he just wrote, denied. No way am I letting this guy out. So, of course, it was Warren Harding, Wilson's successor, who let Eugene Debs out. And Harding is one of these presidents all the historians hate because Wilson, at the end of Wilson's term, there's a big depression, because of all the credit bubble and increase in the money supply and the war and everything. There's this big depression, and Warren Harding doesn't do a thing about it, and it goes away. I mean, historians hate that. They hate that. By the time it even occurred to him that maybe something ought to be done, the thing was over. And it was a worse downturn, actually, than, in terms of a lot of the statistics, than the Great Depression. So they hate Harding. The fact that not only was he doing nothing, he's smoking, he's drinking during the Depression, during Prohibition, he's playing poker. He's doing some things in the White House that maybe, a chaste man wouldn't do, but that's a whole other matter. But here's this simple America. As recently as the 1920s, you could knock on the White House door, and Warren Harding would answer. It's hard to imagine the pre-imperial U.S., that this was possible. Before, he's got legions of people. You'd get, mowed down if you so much as looked at him the wrong way. But anyway, so poor Eugene Debs was finally released, on the, and Harding said, I wanted him to have his Christmas dinner with his wife. Just a simple, humane, non-ideological response to this situation. Well, Eugene Debs, sitting in there, unjustly imprisoned, runs for president from prison. How can you not love this guy? He runs for president, he gets 1 million votes from prison, and he had a campaign button that said, for president, convict number 9653. That is a beauty. I've got to look this thing up on eBay, if that's still around. But anyway, ladies and gentlemen, what I'll leave you with, so we at least have a couple minutes for questions. I know it's so hot in here, and I'm sure they've got the air conditioning cranked, but there's only so much you can do. Just leave you with this little thought by Lysander Spooner, which was, Lysander Spooner acknowledged that, yes, the big government in our day, Spooner's writing the 1860s and 70s, he's talking about big government in our day, And he's saying that, I recognize, he said, that probably the Constitution does not authorize a lot of what the government is doing. So to some limited degree, the Constitution is blameless, But he said, we either have two options, though, here. Either the Constitution does authorize this huge government we see around us, or it has been unable to stop it. And either way, it is unfit to exist. And so for those of you who have been on my case for talking about the Constitution, I leave you with that radical thought, and I hope you're satisfied.